All right, Test J, Section 2, Question 4. A consumer says the latest Connerly report suggests that Oxenfree prepackaged meals are virtually devoid of nutritional value. That's a pretty solid attack. To say virtually devoid of nutritional value means basically no nutritional value. So the Connerly report is attacking Oxenfree. Now, are they correct? I don't know. Maybe they have evidence, maybe they don't have evidence. All right, second sentence. But the Connerly report is commissioned by Danto Foods, Oxenfree's largest corporate rival. And early drafts of the report are submitted for approval to Danto Foods' Public Relations Department. At this point, I can actually predict the flaw that they're about to make. Just because you're biased does not mean you're wrong on the LSAT, y'all. If you ask me what the very best way is to study for the LSAT, I'm going to tell you that it's lsatdemon.com. I am totally biased. I own half of that shit. And I teach all the classes, or a lot of the classes, and I love it, and I think we're great. But the fact that I'm biased does not in any way mean that I am wrong. The next sentence, of course, they go ahead and do it. Because of the obvious bias of this report, it is clear that Oxenfree's prepackaged meals really are nutritious. Wow! Not only did they make one flaw here, but they made two flaws. So the first flaw would be, because you're biased, therefore you're wrong. Or because you're biased, therefore we shouldn't evaluate your evidence, or something like that. Which they do here. You know, they're clearly trying to dismiss this report because of the bias. But they go one step further here. They make the flaw of going a step too far. They think that if they have discredited this report, they have therefore proven the opposite of the conclusion of the report. Look what they're doing here. They're saying, oh, well, you know, you're obviously, your report is biased. And so not only are we going to dismiss your report, we're actually going to take your report as proof of the opposite of what your report was claiming. That's bizarre. If that were valid logic, we could always just make a bad argument against the point we're trying to prove. And then we'd say, oh, well, because this was a really bad argument against my case, therefore I win. That's not logically correct. The reasoning in the consumer's argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that the argument what? Again, I have two predictions here. One is, just because you're biased doesn't mean you're wrong. Two, even if this report is total bullshit, that doesn't prove the opposite of what the report was trying to prove. A, did it treat evidence that there is an apparent bias as evidence that the Connerly report's claims are false? Yes, it did. And that's actually what they did there. Some of you advanced students will notice that they actually wrapped both of those flaws into one answer choice here. There is a problem with just because they're biased doesn't mean anything. And two, they actually did go the next step and say this is therefore proof against your claim. A is a perfect answer. This is a flaw question. They did what A is describing, and it's a problem that they did it, and that's how we know that this is the correct answer for a flaw question. Now, I'm always going to read all five. I'm expecting them to be wrong. It should be very easy to dismiss them quickly. I'm probably not going to have to read all the way through each of these answers to get rid of them, but it's just like safety first. I'm just going to kind of double check here. So B, draws a conclusion based solely on an unrepresentative sample of Oxenfree's products. You can't pick that answer because you don't know that they did that. You don't have any evidence about what the sample was. They didn't tell you anything in the facts about the sample. Flaw questions are evidence-based. Did they do it? No, they didn't. Well, then we can't pick it. C. Fails to take into account the possibility that Oxenfree has just as much motivation to create negative publicity for Danto as Danto has to create negative publicity for Oxenfree. What now? I don't pick answers that I don't understand. And that whole thing is like, wait, you're saying what now? That you failed to take into account the possibility that Oxenfree also has bias? Well, I guess they did do that. They failed to take into account lots of things. I mean, they only presented us with, 3 sentences? So there's lots of things they didn't talk about. So I guess they did fail to take into account this possibility. They did it. But it's not a problem that they did it. I mean, they also failed to take into account the possibility that the weather in California is good. They failed to take into account the possibility that the weather in Wisconsin is horrible. So what? Like, just because they didn't talk about that thing doesn't mean that it's a problem that they didn't talk about that thing. So they did it, but it's not a problem, and so we can't pick C. D says, fails to provide evidence that Danto Foods prepackaged meals are not more nutritious than Oxenfree's are. I mean, that just wasn't their point, right? Again, they didn't bring it up, but the nutritional value of Danto Foods was never in question here. The only thing that is relevant here is this report says one thing, but there's bias in the report. Therefore, we're going to conclude the opposite of the report, which is super weird and bad and flawed logic, and that's what A is describing. D, Danto Foods, they never made any claim about the nutritional value of their own foods. D is just irrelevant. E, presumes without providing justification that Danto Foods' public relations department would not approve a draft of a report that was hostile to Danto Foods products, which also is irrelevant. This report was about Oxenfree prepackaged foods, not about Danto not about Danto Foods. And so E is not a fair accusation. They did not make that presumption because we never had a report on the table that was about Danto Foods' own products. The answer here is A. It was pretty predictable. I would think for an intermediate or advanced student, I think you could have probably predicted that answer. Even for a basic novice student, though, you got to find the one that they did, and it's a problem that they did it, and A is the only one that meets both of those criteria. That's why the answer here is A.